As we look around the living world, we see only plants and animals, right? Well, no. Although early scientists saw these two categories as the only kingdoms of living organisms, we know now that plants and animals are but two of a number of kingdoms representing life on Earth. One of the forgotten kingdoms that is neither plant nor animal may surprise you because they are all around you. I'm talking about fungi, most visible as mushrooms and wood decay fungus. To learn about the forgotten kingdom, I went to two of the best-known mycologists, or experts on fungi, in North Carolina and the nation. They are Dr. Larry Grand of North Carolina State University and Dr. Ritis Vilgalis of Duke University.
For years, fungi were considered to be primitive plants. Going back into even before the 1700s, we have documentation of fungi even in the Bible and even pre-Bible literature. And as a result, they felt that because they were associated with plants and they somewhat looked like plants, most of them come out of the ground, that they were kind of plants that weren't quite up to par. And as the research developed, and as we became more and more involved in looking at these on a more chemical and microscopic level and biological level, it was quite obvious that we were dealing with a group of organisms that were not in fact primitive plants. They were in fact a group of organisms all to themselves. And as a result, probably back in the 40s and 50s, there was a move to make them their own kingdom, if you will, separate from plants, and it just took a while for that to occur. And back in the 1970s and then on into the 80s, with the advent of some of the molecular work that we're able to do now and some of the genetic work that we're able to do, it became very, very apparent that we were dealing with a group of organisms very different from plants.
I asked Ritis Vilgalis whether fungi are more closely related to plants or animals.
So a lot of people don't realize that the fungi are a separate kingdom unto themselves. The fungi are a unique evolutionary group. They've acquired some unique characters that separate them from other kingdoms. If we look at an evolutionary tree of life, what you'll see is that the fungi are the closest relatives to the animal kingdom.
Larry Grand told me that DNA research has revealed a more astounding connection. Fungi may be one of your close relatives.
In fact, the very modern research, especially the DNA research and the genetic research, would indicate that fungi, believe it or not, are much more related or closer related to humans than they were to plants.
Having traveled to many parts of the world during my life, I have noticed that some cultures are fungi friendly. Ritis told me that societies can be divided by their appreciation of fungi.
So there's one thought about the history of civilization is that we can classify societies according to whether or not they were fond of fungi or afraid of fungi. And our culture, deriving from Anglo-Saxon culture, is mostly mycophobic. However, if you go further east to Eastern Europe, you find cultures that are crazy about mushrooms, and certainly Italians love their porcini, and as you go to Asia, most people are quite familiar with edible mushrooms and the use of fungi for medicine. But for some reason, our American ancestors were mostly mycophobes.
Now, knowing that fungi are a separate kingdom, that they may be a close relative of yours, and that Westerners are generally fearful of fungi, especially mushrooms, I asked Larry Grand to tell me the major distinctions between fungi and plants and animals.
Fungi differ from plants in their inability to produce their own food. You probably learned back in high school or even prior to that plants can manufacture their own food through sunlight and carbon dioxide and the chloroplast or chlorophyll production. Fungi do not have that ability. It's very simple as that. They have to rely on other sources of food to gather their energy. Now, as a result, we find that that is probably one of the most significant differences between plants and fungi. In addition, probably most people think of fungi as mushrooms, and hopefully we'll learn that there are a lot more fungi than just mushrooms. They're a very primitive organism, and they have the ability to secrete enzymes which break down organic matter, such as leaves or wood or dead animals or insects, etc. Break down the compounds there into compounds that are digested or taken up by the fungi for their energy source.
Fungi are sometimes confused with some well-known common living organisms. Larry Grand, whose enthusiasm for fungi is infectious, helped to clear up the confusion.
Very often people tend to confuse fungi with some other organisms that are very common in our ecosystems, in our forests, and in our meadows, and some of our other areas at the outdoors. For example, lichens are a very common type of organism that's found. We find it in soil surfaces, we find it on the side of trees, on branches, sometimes we even find them on telephone poles, etc. A lichen is a very unique kind of structure. It is in fact a symbiotic or beneficial relationship between a fungus and an alga. And it is a true beneficial relationship between these two organisms. The fungus basically supplies part of the food and certainly the protection and oftentimes the water that's necessary for these algae, and the algae, because they can make their food, they are very primitive plants, provide to a large degree the nutrition necessary for the fungus to grow. So it's a very interesting relationship. Now, another group of organisms that are often confused with fungi are mosses. They tend to grow in very wet areas, as do many fungi. Mosses, in fact, are a primitive plant, and they can, in fact, manufacture their own food. Very different from fungi. One that some people do confuse at times are mistletoes. These are, in fact, plants, and in fact, they're not even primitive plants. They're fairly well-developed plants. If you took a good look at a mistletoe plant, it is green. It is loaded with chloroplasts. It can manufacture chlorophyll. There's no problem at all there with manufacturing its own food. And again, the basic difference from that and a fungus. But they're pretty much on their own, with the exception of getting their water from the trees on which they're growing. They really aren't even related to fungi at all.
After Larry Grand helped clear up some common misconceptions that often surround fungi, I asked Ritas Vilgelis to describe the mostly unseen world of fungal organisms.
So the main thing to keep in mind is that most fungi are technically microorganisms. So we only see the fruiting bodies at the time that the fungi fruit, and the vast majority of fungi don't even produce fruiting structures. So much of the activity that we see when we see mushrooms fruiting is primarily due to the fact that they're just imbibing water at that point. By the time it rains, a lot of these mushrooms have already formed, and it's just the rain that helps them absorb moisture and to expand into mature fruiting bodies. And for some species, that literally happens overnight. And for others, it might take a few days, but it's certainly much faster than what we're used to seeing when we watch corn grow or something.
This explains why you often see mushrooms after a rain in the summer or fall. They emerge literally overnight. Exploring North Carolina filmed mushrooms across North Carolina. Although not related to flowers, the colors, shapes, and features of mushrooms, the fruiting bodies of fungi, make them beautiful additions to our landscape. Even though many fungi are microorganisms which sometimes fruit and become mushrooms, fungi can be very large organisms. I asked Ritas and Larry about giant fungi and whether in a North Carolina forest there may be a humongous fungus.
I'd like you to think about fungi as you would an iceberg. You probably have thought about or have heard about an iceberg being 9/10 below the water. I would like you to think of that concept in regard to fungi. The main body of the organism is microscopic. It's either underground, it's on plant roots, or it's in piles of wood or dead branches, decaying organic matter like this.
Because fungi have the ability to expand outward as they grow, and as these fungal filaments grow and divide, a single fungal individual can actually establish an enormous biomass. And in fact, that's what you see when you see a fairy ring in a lawn, a fairy ring of mushrooms. That represents one single genetic individual. So if you can imagine now a fungal clone expanding through the forest, if that fungus feeds on the roots of trees and expands to cover other root systems, one single individual can then occupy a very large area. And that's the case of the humongous fungus Armillaria.
This was found on the border between Wisconsin and Michigan, occupying an area of some, I believe it was 300 acres. It was estimated to weigh approximately 100 tons. And up to this point, the largest living organism was thought to be, I think it's the great blue whale, which comes in a little bit less than 100 tons. And here we had a fungus that weighed 100 tons or more. Now, it didn't take very long before somebody came up with, well, we have a bigger fungus than this. And out in Oregon, they reported a fungus, and interestingly enough, a species of Armillaria that occupied 2 square miles. And I never saw a figure on the estimate of how much this weighed. But the interesting aspect of this was that it was, in fact, basically the same organism. The DNA that was looked at over this large area was identical in all instances. Given adequate nutrients, moisture, and a proper temperature, they will grow infinitely.
It is fun to talk about huge fungi, but what functions do they perform, and why are fungi so important to us?
One of the important roles of fungi in nature is the area of symbiosis. And basically what we're talking about here is the ability to grow with another organism. And in the case of most fungi, they are quite beneficial to the growth of most of the plants on the face of the earth. This is kind of hard to believe. In the case of the symbiotic relationship between a number of fungi and plants, especially in a forested ecosystem, they form a symbiotic structure or association called a mycorrhiza. But basically the relationship is this. The vegetative part of the fungus, it's called the hyphae or the mycelium, literally wraps around the feeder roots of these trees, say pine, like a loblolly pine or a shortleaf pine that we have in our region here, and gathers nutrients from the soil, pipes it back into the root, and the plant then takes that nutrients and uses it to continue its growth. Many of these mycorrhizal fungi involved in this relationship produce antibiotic-like substances that inhibit the infection by certain root-infecting fungi, so that the overall health of the plant is affected not only by the nutrients that are supplied, but also as a protective mechanism.
In addition to providing nutrients and protection for plants and trees, fungi perform a critical function: the decomposition of forest waste.
The fungi that decompose are the primary agents of decomposing wood and lignin and plant material. If they weren't around, those processes would have to occur by the action of bacteria, so the world would probably smell a lot worse. But also, the bacteria just can't get the job done the way the fungi do. Fungi can decompose a log in the order of a couple of years at most.
Imagine, if you would, what would happen if we didn't have fungi, especially the very large group of fungi that are responsible for breaking down woody plant material, including leaves, twigs, trunks, roots that you often don't think about because they're underground and out of sight. What would happen if we didn't have fungi to break these down and put them back into the nutrient cycle system in, say, a forested ecosystem? it would not be very long before you were knee-deep, waist-deep, and maybe eyeball-deep in a matter of 10 to 20 to 25 years. And if you would think back to 1996, for example, what happened in 1996 in September? Hurricane Fran blew itself out up through Raleigh, North Carolina, and then on past us, so it came inland. We estimated that 40 to 50% of the trees were on the ground after Fran came through North Carolina. And what do you see? Maybe a slight bump, but the reason for that is because of these important wood decay fungi and their role in the ecosystem. It's absolutely phenomenal what they can do.
A fungus can create hollow logs for woodpeckers, squirrels, bears, and even reptiles. Fungi are necessary for healthy forest, but they also serve animals and humans directly.
There's as many different kinds of mushrooms as there are different kinds of vegetables, and so you can imagine there's a variety of different nutritional values depending on the species and how it's grown. But overall, most wild mushrooms have considerable nutritional value, and people have survived by eating nothing but mushrooms. So they do have a balance of proteins with a balance of amino acids, lots of mineral and vitamin. So a lot of the things that we call molds are actually part of the food we eat. And by nook or crook, people discovered some time ago that certain types of fungal activities are desirable. So fungi as yeasts are used in the fermentation of alcohols. They're also used to make leavened bread. So those are just two examples of the use of yeasts in food. A lot of molds impart flavors to food. So a lot of your camemberts and Roquefort cheeses have fungi growing in them. A lot of soy sauce products are also involving some kind of fungal fermentation. And certainly you can find almost all different groups of fungi being used either as food or as additives for the foods that we eat.
Fungi are found in foods and beverages, and many species of lovely, fresh mushrooms are available in supermarkets. There are also plenty of edible mushrooms in our forest, but pickers must be very cautious.
And we in North Carolina are absolutely blessed with a relatively large number of not only mushrooms, but edible mushrooms as well. In this particular case, I personally have probably not bought a mushroom in a very long period of time because we have so many very good mushrooms in our natural flora here. Don't go out, pick up a mushroom, and use some of these old myths about, oh, this isn't poisonous because it didn't turn garlic black in the frying pan, or it didn't turn a silver coin black in the frying pan, or I saw a squirrel eating it, or I saw a deer eating it, therefore it must be edible. There's no way to really look at a mushroom and tell whether it's poison or not unless you really know what the species is. In other words, identify it. Bring it to me. I will be more than happy to identify it. That's one of the services I provide as a professor at State. And I get any number of calls or specimens brought in to determine whether they're edible or not. I only charge about 50% of the take, so that works out pretty well. Seriously though, we do have some very toxic mushrooms in our flora, and it turns out that many of these are quite beneficial as far as nutrient recycling is concerned, but on the other hand, they do produce toxins, and these are ones that you certainly want to avoid. So as they say, there are old mushroom collectors and there are bold mushroom collectors, but there are no old, bold mushroom collectors that eat them.
Mushrooms are now farmed in North Carolina. One special mushroom is the truffle, as I learned from Franklin Garland near Hillsboro.
truffle growing is actually a farm crop. The way the truffles are grown is by inoculating trees with the fungus and then planting them out in rows. And the maintenance of those is like any other row crop that you plant, actually an orchard, much like a peach orchard or apple orchard. You are growing little trees out there, and on the roots of these is the fungus, and between the roots you get the truffles producing. In the case of the truffles, the mushroom is called a symbiote. The symbiotic relationship means that it's mutually beneficial with the tree. It happens to be one part of the ecosystem out here, so the fungus is actually supplying nutrients to the tree, and in return the tree supplies nutrients to the fungus. One of the unique things about truffles is that they grow underground. Consequently, they don't have a natural way of exposing themselves on the surface to be distributed in nature. In other words, just to propagate, to put out their spore. Nature has made sure that they do propagate by giving them a lot of flavor, a lot of smell, so animals can dig them up and then pass them along. Of course, one of the fringe benefits is that they taste really, really good, and as humans, we like to eat them, and we can get to them as well.
Although there are several truffles native to North America, Franklin grows a European variety long known for its culinary qualities.
The unique flavor of the truffle is what really makes them very, very expensive. There's really nothing quite like it. They can be used as flavoring for other foods, as a garnish, or eaten whole. And when asked what they taste like, pretty much everybody has to answer they taste like truffles.
So how are they harvested? Truffle farmers use pigs or trained dogs to locate these delicacies. Now you know that fungi are important in our ecosystems as foods and as farm products. But let's not forget their medicinal value.
So penicillin is probably the most famous fungal antibiotic product that most of us are familiar with, and the whole penicillin group of antibiotics were originally isolated from fungi, from the genus Penicillium. There's a number of other products that fungi produce that are used in cancer therapy. Taxol, for example, is used in cancer treatment, and it's now known to be a fungal product as well.
The neosporin, cyclosporin, neomycin, streptomycin. In fact, almost all of the antibiotics that end in mycin are fungal produced.
Fungi, the forgotten kingdom, are all around us and affect our lives in countless ways. They will most certainly have a role in our future. They may power our cars through fungi-produced biofuels and may supply us with paper through eco-friendly biopulping. So the next time you enjoy wine and cheese, thank a fungus. The next time you take a miracle drug, thank a fungus. And the next time you walk on rich forest topsoil, thank a fungus. They all come from the forgotten kingdom.